My name is Clara. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words that sound harmless on the surface. Quiet, sensible, a little scattered, good with ideas, but not with money. I've worked in roles that reward patience and consistency, research support, documentation, and back-end problem solving. The kind of work where, if you do it well, no one really notices you at all. People often assume that if you're not loud about your ambitions, you don't have any. If you don't defend yourself immediately, you must not have a defense. If you don't perform confidence in the way they recognize, you must be unstable. I learned early on that perception is rarely about truth. It's about convenience. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone for entertainment. And it definitely isn't about painting myself as a hero or my parents as villains. It's about something quieter, and honestly, more unsettling than that. What happens when the people who know you best decide who you are for you and put it on record? A few years ago, I learned that my parents had testified that I was financially unstable. Not in a casual conversation, not in a moment of frustration, but formally, in a process that directly affected my future. Their statements weren't spontaneous opinions. The evaluation that followed was based on statements they coordinated, carefully, calmly, and without ever telling me it was happening. At the time, I didn't fully understand the weight of it. I didn't even know all the details. What I felt instead was a familiar, dull confusion, the kind you get when something hurts but you can't quite point to the wound. I trusted that if I stayed reasonable, if I didn't overreact, clarity would eventually arrive on its own. It didn't. What arrived instead was a slow education in how silence can be interpreted, how narratives harden when they go unchallenged, and how easily concern can become control when it's documented by the right people. This story follows an emotional journey, not a dramatic arc. There are no shouting matches, no last-minute rescues, no sudden windfalls. There is only time, observation, and the gradual realization that being underestimated is not always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's a position. I'm telling this in my own words because honesty matters more to me than sympathy. I don't want you to take sides. I don't want you to feel outraged on my behalf. I want you to listen the way I eventually learned to listen, to patterns, to pauses, to what people assume you'll never question. If you've ever been labeled in a way that didn't quite fit or had your competence discussed without your presence, you may recognize parts of yourself here. And if you haven't, I hope this story still offers something useful, a reminder that quiet does not mean unaware, and calm does not mean powerless. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever wondered who benefits most from the version of you that other people agree on? To my parents, I was never a problem. That's important to say clearly. Problems demand attention, decisions, and discomfort. I didn't. I was something else entirely. Manageable. I was the child who didn't rebel loudly. I didn't storm out or slam doors. I did well enough in school to avoid concern, but not so well that I became impressive. I followed paths that looked sensible from the outside and invisible from the inside. When relatives asked what I did, my parents answered for me, usually with a tone that suggested I was still figuring things out, even when I wasn't. They didn't describe me inaccurately so much as selectively. They emphasized my pauses, not my progress. My caution, not my consistency. My questions, not my conclusions. Over time, this framing became habitual. It wasn't cruel, it was casual. And because it was casual, no one ever challenged it. In family settings, I was the listener, the note-taker, the one asked to help organize, to keep track of details, to remember dates and documents. I was useful in the background and unremarkable in the foreground. When decisions were discussed, financial, legal, future-oriented, I was present, but not included. My presence was treated as emotional, not intellectual. If I disagreed, it was seen as confusion. If I hesitated, it was seen as incapacity. And if I stayed quiet, it was taken as confirmation. What's strange is that none of this felt overt at the time. It felt like gravity, just the way things were arranged. My parents spoke about responsibility often. They worried aloud. They framed their opinions as concern. And concern, when repeated often enough, begins to sound like expertise. I internalized this more than I realized, not as self-doubt exactly, but as a habit of containment. I learned to present only what was asked for, to simplify my thoughts before sharing them, to assume that if something was important, someone else would take charge of it. They trusted me with tasks, but not with authority, with execution, but not with judgment. And because I was competent, the system worked. Their image of me was never tested, only reinforced. The extended family followed their lead. Friends absorbed the tone. Even professionals, later on, would pick up subtle cues from the way my parents spoke, the careful wording, the preemptive explanations, the small disclaimers attached to my independence. She means well. She's very creative, just not practical. She gets overwhelmed easily. These phrases floated around me like soft furniture, never sharp enough to hurt, but always shaping where I could move. The truth was less dramatic and more inconvenient. I paid my bills. I saved modestly. I avoided debt. I made conservative choices on purpose, not because I didn't understand risk, but because I understood it too well. I asked questions because I wanted precision, not reassurance. But nuance doesn't travel well in families. Roles do. And my role was the one who needed guidance. I didn't fight it because fighting would have required energy I didn't yet know how to spend wisely. I also didn't recognize it as something that could calcify into a record. I thought of it as interpersonal, temporary, and emotional. I didn't know it would one day be written down, summarized, and presented as fact. Looking back, what stands out most is not how they underestimated me, but how comfortable everyone was with that underestimation, including me. I wasn't invisible. I was seen incorrectly. And because that version of me was convenient, it became the version that mattered, at least for a while. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important when it happened. That's the nature of small cuts. You don't register them as injuries. You register them as friction. Something slightly off, easily ignored. It was a meeting I hadn't asked for, framed as a conversation. My parents told me they had spoken with a financial advisor they trusted. Not my advisor. Someone they had known for years. They said they'd mention me casually in the way people mention weather or health updates. Just context, they explained. Nothing formal. What followed was a list of observations, not accusations, observations. I seemed stressed when money came up, that I'd changed jobs a few times, that I preferred stability over growth. I asked too many questions before making decisions. They said all of this gently, almost apologetically. They were worried, they said. They wanted to protect me from future pressure, from responsibilities I might not be ready for. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because the room felt arranged for agreement. They spoke in a unified tone, trading sentences smoothly, like something rehearsed but not memorized. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Families talk, parents worry, this was normal. But something lodged in me anyway. Not fear, not anger. A quiet note of alertness. Later that week, I realized they had shared these impressions without checking them against facts. They hadn't asked about my savings. They hadn't looked at my records. They hadn't asked how I planned or what I prioritized. They had spoken for me, assuming the shape of my inner life based on the role I'd always played. When I tried to clarify, lightly, politely, I was met with reassurance instead of curiosity. We're not saying you can't handle things, my mother said. We just want to make sure you're supported, my father added. Support, in that moment, sounded like a ceiling. What made it a cut wasn't the content. It was the pattern. They had spoken to someone with authority about me, without me, and everyone involved seemed comfortable with that arrangement. I mentioned it to a relative later, casually, expecting mild surprise. Instead, I got a nod of understanding. They just worry because you're sensitive, she said. You've always been that way. Sensitive. Another soft word. Another lid is placed gently on top of something more complex. No one meant harm. That's what made it easy to dismiss. No one raised their voice. No one threatened anything. There was no single sentence I could point to and say, this is wrong. It was all reasonable. And because it was reasonable, it went unchallenged. Except it didn't leave me. I started noticing how often decisions were pre-decided before reaching me. How often explanations came packaged with conclusions. How frequently my hesitations were framed as incapacity rather than discernment. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself this was family dynamics, not destiny. I told myself that labels dissolve with time. I told myself that if anything truly mattered, I would be asked directly. What I didn't realize was that this first small cut wasn't about money at all. It was about authorship. They had begun to author my story in rooms I wasn't in, and because I didn't object, because I stayed calm, because I didn't dramatize, it was taken as consent. Looking back, I don't blame myself for missing the warning. The moment didn't announce itself as significant. It didn't hurt enough to demand attention. It simply changed the shape of the ground under my feet just slightly. But small changes accumulate, quietly, efficiently. And once a narrative exists outside of you, it doesn't need your participation to continue. After that first moment, nothing dramatic happened. And that, in retrospect, was the point. Life went on. Holidays came and went. Conversations repeated themselves with small variations. My parents didn't bring up that advisor again, at least not directly. But the tone they had used that day began to echo in other places. Subtly, persistently. When finances came up, the room would soften. Voices lowered. Explanations became careful, simplified, and padded with reassurance. Someone would say, This might be a bit much before I had a chance to respond, or we'll handle this part, with a smile that implied relief on everyone's behalf. At first, I corrected gently. I'd say, I actually already thought about that, or I'm comfortable with numbers like this. The responses were always kind and dismissive. Oh, we know you can, my mother would say. It's just easier this way, my father would add. Easier for whom was never discussed. Over time, I stopped correcting. Not because I agreed, but because each correction required more effort than the outcome justified. The conversation would bend back to its original shape anyway. So I conserved energy, I listened, I adjusted. This is how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition that goes unexamined. I noticed it in stories told about me. How my job changes were framed as instability, not intentional transitions. How my cautious financial planning was described as fear. How my questions were retold as confusion. None of these descriptions was outright false. They were just incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated often enough, becomes a kind of truth. What unsettled me most was how easily others accepted these versions. Friends of my parents, distant relatives, even acquaintances I'd just met, would respond to me as if they already knew something essential about my limits. Advice came unsolicited. Praise came conditionally. You're doing so well, considering. That must be hard for you. I could never manage money like that either. I began to understand that my silence was being interpreted not as restraint, but as confirmation. The less I pushed back, the more coherent their image of me became. Still, I rationalized this. Staying quiet. I told myself that family harmony mattered. Challenging these assumptions would only create tension, that it wasn't worth disrupting relationships over something so abstract. After all, no one had taken anything from me yet. Nothing concrete had happened. This was the most dangerous part, the absence of urgency. When harm arrives slowly, it feels optional to address. I also believed, on some level, that competence would eventually assert itself. Those facts would correct impressions. That if a real decision ever arose, my track record would speak louder than perception. I didn't yet understand how records work. How testimony, once given, doesn't fade the way conversations do. How official impressions are rarely updated, they're simply referenced. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to protest, but it was steady enough to shape outcomes. And because I participated in the system, by staying calm, by staying agreeable, I became part of its justification. No one had to silence me. I had learned how to quiet myself. I remember one evening, sitting alone after a family dinner, replaying a conversation in my head. Someone had said, "You wouldn't want to deal with that kind of responsibility anyway." I had smiled and nodded, as if they'd just spared me a burden. That was the moment something shifted internally. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Just a thin crack in a long-held assumption. I realized I had been confusing peace with safety. Peace is what you maintain. Safety is what protects you. And I had been maintaining peace at the cost of being accurately known. I didn't confront anyone after that realization. I didn't announce it. I simply stopped assuming that misunderstanding would resolve itself. I stopped believing that time alone would correct the record. Normalization depends on your participation. And for the first time, I began to consider what might happen if I withdrew it. Not loudly, not defiantly, but deliberately. Quietly. Once you see a role clearly, you start noticing how often it's being reinforced. Mine was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. It lived in expectations, in what was asked of me versus what was decided without me. I was the reliable one for logistics, for follow-through, for remembering details no one else wanted to track. I was not the one trusted with final calls. When paperwork needed organizing, I was included. When the strategy was discussed, I was informed after the fact. My competence was welcome as long as it stayed operational. The moment it edged toward authority, the room subtly rebalanced. This wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. Everyone knew their part, and my part was to support, not steer. I noticed how often my calmness was used as evidence against me. Because I didn't react emotionally, people assumed I didn't care deeply. Because I didn't argue, they assumed I didn't have a position. And because I didn't insist, they assumed I agreed. In family conversations, this role made things smooth. There was always someone else to handle the serious matters. I was spared the stress, they said, protected. Protection is a persuasive word. It makes control sound generous. What I hadn't realized until then was how early this role had been assigned, and how rarely it had been questioned. It had followed me from childhood into adulthood, adapting just enough to remain useful. I was no longer the child who needed help with homework. I was the adult who needed help with big picture decisions. And once that narrative existed, everything fed it. If I paused before answering, it meant I was overwhelmed. If I asked for time, it meant I couldn't decide. If I chose a conservative path, it meant I lacked ambition. There was no interpretation that allowed me to be both cautious and capable. The role also came with an unspoken obligation: gratitude. I was expected to appreciate being managed, to recognize how much easier my life was because others took responsibility for me. Questioning the role felt like ingratitude, even betrayal. So I didn't question it out loud. Instead, I started observing it from a distance, almost academically. I noticed how often decisions were justified by referencing my supposed limits. How frequently were phrases like, "given how Clara is," used as shortcuts to end the discussion. How rarely anyone asked whether those descriptions still applied, or ever had. Most striking of all was how this role benefited everyone else. It reduced conflict, it clarified hierarchy, it allowed others to act without consultation, and because I didn't object, it looked consensual. That realization was sobering, not because I felt exploited, but because I understood my own participation. I had mistaken being low maintenance for being safe. I had believed that if I caused no friction, I would incur no risk. But friction, I was learning, is sometimes the only thing that signals presence. The role didn't collapse when I saw it. Roles don't do that. They persist until something makes them inconvenient. And at that point, I still wasn't inconvenienced. I continued to perform it well, efficiently, calmly, and agreeably. But internally, I stopped identifying with it. I treated it as something I was temporarily playing, not something I was. That separation changed everything. It gave me room to think without urgency, to notice patterns without reacting to them, to imagine alternatives without needing to announce them. I didn't plan anything yet. Planning would have implied conflict, and I wasn't ready for that. What I did instead was stop assuming that the role I'd been assigned was permanent. I let it sit there, intact, unquestioned by others, but no longer unquestioned by me. And sometimes that's the first real shift, not action, not confrontation, just the quiet refusal to confuse a role with an identity. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no revelation, no moment where I suddenly understood everything at once. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that disappears easily if you don't look at it twice. I was sitting alone, reviewing a set of documents I had requested for an entirely practical reason. At the time, I told myself it was just curiosity, a desire to be informed, nothing more. The papers weren't dramatic, they weren't even surprising, but they were tidy. Summaries instead of details, conclusions instead of processes. And threaded through them was a familiar tone, measured, concerned, authoritative. My parents' voices were there, even though their names weren't always attached. Their phrasing, their emphasis, their quiet certainty about who I was and what I could handle. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't let myself articulate before. This wasn't about a single opinion or a single event. It was a structure, and it had been built slowly, with care. I noticed how often uncertainty was attributed to me, even when outcomes were neutral or positive. How caution was framed as fragility. How my desire for clarity was translated into an inability to decide. None of it was overtly hostile. In fact, it was almost affectionate. Concern, documented. And that was the shift, not anger. Clarity. I saw that my parents weren't acting impulsively or emotionally, they were acting consistently, in alignment with a long-held belief about me. A belief that had never been tested because it had never needed to be. I had never forced the issue. Sitting there, I felt something I hadn't felt before in this situation: detachment, not numbness. Distance, the kind that lets you observe without flinching. I realized I had been waiting for permission to be taken seriously, waiting for someone to notice the mismatch between who I was and who they thought I was, waiting for the correction to come from outside. It wasn't going to. What shifted that day was not my relationship with my parents. It was my relationship with waiting. I understood, finally, that silence had two forms. One is avoidance, the other is selection. Until then, my silence had been the first kind. I stayed quiet because I hoped the problem would dissolve, because I didn't want to escalate, because I trusted intentions more than outcomes. But as I read those documents, I felt the second kind of silence take shape, the kind that isn't passive, but precise, the kind that chooses when and where to speak. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't even mention what I'd seen. That wasn't denial, it was discipline. I needed time, not to cool off, but to understand the full system I was inside. That afternoon, I started a list, not of grievances, but of facts. Dates, statements, patterns, who spoke to whom, and when, what was said, and how it was framed. It felt almost boring, which I took as a good sign. Emotional reactions fade, records don't. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to how I felt about being underestimated. I was studying how underestimation functions, and in that quiet, methodical attention, something settled, a sense that I didn't need to correct the narrative immediately. I just needed to stop feeding it. The shift wasn't visible from the outside. I still sounded the same. I still behaved the same. I still occupied the same role. But internally, I stopped assuming good intentions were enough. I stopped mistaking familiarity for safety, and I stopped believing that being calm meant being inactive. That day didn't change my circumstances, it changed my posture. And once posture changes, movement becomes a matter of timing, not force. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still attended the same gatherings. I still responded with the same even tone. I still allowed others to take the lead in conversations that brushed against money, planning, or responsibility. If anything, I became easier to be around. That was intentional. Before, my quietness had been a byproduct of hesitation. Now it was deliberate. I spoke when clarity required it and stayed silent when information was more valuable than reassurance. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped preemptively defending myself. People often mistake silence for emptiness. They don't realize it can be a form of containment. I began to notice how much others revealed when they assumed I wasn't tracking. How freely my parents spoke when they believed the narrative was settled. How often decisions were justified out loud, as if to convince an invisible audience. I listened without interrupting. This wasn't manipulation. It was a restraint. I wasn't trying to trap anyone in their words. I was letting them stand. At the same time, I became more precise in my own life. I tightened routines. I documented finances meticulously. I kept records not because I anticipated conflict, but because clarity had become non-negotiable for me. The irony was that the more organized I became, the more fragile I was perceived to be. My calm was read as compliance. My lack of reaction was read as dependence. "See," my mother once said to a family friend, "she doesn't like dealing with stressful things." I smiled and poured more tea. What she didn't see was that I was dealing with stress differently. Quietly, systematically, without an audience. Silence, when chosen, has weight. It allows other people to move first, to commit to versions of reality they assume will go unchallenged, to leave a trail. I stopped trying to correct small misstatements. I let them accumulate, not out of spite, but out of respect for accuracy. Patterns only emerge when you allow repetition. And repetition there was. My parents spoke to professionals on my behalf. They summarized me, they framed me, they expressed concern. Each time, the language stayed consistent. Each time, it became more formal. I noticed something else too. No one ever asked me directly. Not once did anyone with authority sit across from me and say, "Tell me how you manage money," or "Walk me through your decision-making process." They relied on a proxy, on reputation, on the comfort of continuity. That told me everything I needed to know about how systems listen. They listen to what arrives confidently, consistently, and early. So I made a choice. I would not interrupt the story being told about me. Not yet. I would let it fully form, let it be documented, let it reveal its assumptions. In the meantime, I prepared my own record. This wasn't about outmaneuvering anyone. It was about making sure that when I did speak, I wouldn't be arguing against impressions. I would be presenting facts. Silence bought me time, and time used carefully becomes leverage. I didn't feel powerful during this phase. I felt focused. There's a difference. Power seeks expression. Focus seeks alignment. I aligned my actions with my values, not with others' expectations. I stopped performing reassurance. I stopped trying to be understood in the moment. The more I did this, the clearer something became. My parents mistook my cooperation for agreement, and because I no longer corrected them, they assumed they had been right all along. That assumption would matter later. For now, I stayed where I was, calm, observant, unrushed. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I used. Preparation rarely looks like preparation from the outside. It looks like routine, like consistency, like someone settling into their place and becoming easier to predict. That's what they never noticed. I didn't announce that I was learning. I didn't frame anything as a project. I simply began paying attention to the mechanics behind the assumptions. If I were financially unstable, I wanted to understand exactly what criteria supported that claim and what evidence contradicted it. So I started where systems start, definitions. I learned how stability is measured when people aren't speaking casually, but formally. How terms like capacity, competence, and risk tolerance are operationalized. I read guidelines, not opinions, policies, not blog posts. I didn't skim, I annotated. At the same time, I documented my own life with a neutrality that surprised even me. Income streams, expense ratios, savings patterns, decision timelines. I didn't curate them to look impressive. I recorded them to be accurate. Accuracy, I learned, is persuasive in a way emotion never is. I also tracked language, the specific phrases my parents used. How often was concern linked to hypothetical stress? how frequently my caution was framed as avoidance. I noted when statements shifted from personal opinion to generalized claim. None of this felt dramatic. It felt administrative, which in hindsight was perfect. They continued to underestimate me because nothing about my behavior signaled urgency. I still deferred in conversations. I still asked questions instead of making declarations. I still let others take the lead. What changed was my internal posture. I stopped seeing these interactions as relational alone. I began seeing them as inputs. I also sought knowledge quietly. I attended workshops that weren't advertised as transformational. I consulted professionals without announcing it to my family. I asked questions that sounded hypothetical, but weren't. What kind of documentation usually matters? How are secondhand statements weighed? What's the difference between concern and evidence? No one suspects intent and curiosity, especially from someone already categorized as unsure. The most important thing I learned during this phase was how much systems rely on momentum. Once a narrative exists, it doesn't need to be constantly defended. It just needs to be referenced. She's always been a bit, you know how she is. Given her situation, those phrases carry weight, not because they're precise, but because they're familiar. I made sure my record was just as familiar to me. Months passed, then more. Nothing outward changed. Inside, my understanding deepened. I could see where the narrative about me was strong and where it was thin. I could tell which assumptions were emotional and which were procedural, and I could see the gap. The gap wasn't small. What they never noticed was that I had stopped relying on being perceived correctly. I was building something independent of perception. They also didn't notice how often they repeated themselves, how their language calcified, how little new information they introduced over time. Concern, once genuine, had become habitual. That told me something crucial. They weren't reassessing me. They were maintaining an image. Images are fragile when exposed to contrast. I didn't feel vindictive about this realization. I felt calm, almost relieved, because it meant I didn't need to persuade anyone emotionally. I just needed to let two records exist side by side. One coordinated and confident, the other quiet and complete. I understood then why being underestimated can be an advantage. It lowers scrutiny, it invites assumptions, it creates space to work without interference. This phase taught me patience, not the kind that waits, but the kind that builds. I wasn't waiting for a moment to strike. I was preparing for a moment to speak. And when that moment came, I wanted my words to land once, cleanly, irreversibly. So I kept going, documenting, learning, aligning. They thought nothing was happening. They were right in the way that matters least. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already been circling it for months, approaching from different angles, checking assumptions, resisting the urge to jump to conclusions. I had learned enough by then to know that certainty earned too quickly is usually borrowed. What finally brought everything into focus was a single document I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse anyone. It simply laid out a chain of references: who spoke to whom, whose statements were relied upon, and how evaluations were formed in the absence of direct assessment. I read it slowly, then again, and there it was, unmistakable in its restraint. The evaluation that labeled me financially unstable was based almost entirely on coordinated statements from my parents, not on interviews with me, not on independent verification, not on the records I had kept for years without anyone asking to see them. It wasn't corruption. It was convenient. The system had done what systems do. It trusted the most confident, consistent narrative presented early. And my parents, without malice but with certainty, had provided exactly that. What I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It was something closer to stillness. This was the private reveal. The realization that nothing about this situation was accidental, but neither was it personal in the way I'd once imagined. My parents weren't reacting to me. They were acting on a version of me that had never been challenged because it had never needed to be. And I had allowed it, by staying quiet for reasons that once felt virtuous. Seeing the mechanism stripped away the emotional fog. There was no mystery left to solve, no dramatic confrontation required, just a clear understanding of leverage. The leverage wasn't money, it wasn't secrets, it wasn't even evidence in the way people usually think of it. It was a contrast. I could now see with precision where their coordinated narrative ended and where mine began. I knew exactly what had been claimed, how it had been framed, and what had not been asked. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful. It made me careful. Power seeks speed. Care seeks permanence. I didn't celebrate this clarity. I closed the document, made a note in my notebook, and went about my day. That was important to me. I didn't want this understanding to become reactive fuel. I wanted it to remain a tool. In the days that followed, I reviewed everything again, not to confirm wrongdoing, but to confirm accuracy. I questioned my own interpretations. I checked for bias. I made sure I could explain the situation without adjectives. When you can describe something plainly, without needing emotional emphasis, you usually understand it well enough to act. And I was approaching that point. What struck me most was how unnecessary deception would have been if anyone had simply asked me to speak. A single direct conversation could have prevented everything that followed. But systems don't correct themselves out of courtesy. They correct themselves when information arrives that can't be ignored. I understood then that the moment would come when silence would no longer serve me. Continuing to observe would only reinforce the existing structure, but that moment had to be chosen, not forced. I didn't rush toward it. I let the clarity settle. I adjusted my expectations. I grieved quietly, not for money or inheritance, but for the ease that had been lost. The ease of assuming that being reasonable would protect me. It wouldn't. Protection would come from precision. The private reveal wasn't a turning point in action. It was a turning point in certainty. From that moment on, I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting, misinterpreting, or imagining patterns. I wasn't. And because I wasn't, I no longer needed to explain myself to myself. That kind of certainty doesn't demand expression. It waits. Certainty doesn't force action. It offers options. That was the stage I was in after the private reveal. Not compelled, not cornered, just aware. Awareness changes the landscape. What once felt like a single narrow path suddenly branches, and each direction carries a different cost. I laid those options out carefully, the way I had learned to do with everything else. I could confront my parents directly, sit across from them, name what I knew, demand an explanation. That path promised emotional release, maybe even an apology. It also promised defensiveness, denial, and a reframing of the issue as a misunderstanding rather than a consequence. I could do nothing. Continue as I had been, letting the system run its course. Accept the narrative as fixed. That option offered comfort and familiarity, but it required me to accept a future shaped by decisions I hadn't participated in. Or I could act without confrontation, correct the record rather than the people, address the structure, not the story. That was the irreversible option. Once taken, it wouldn't escalate emotionally, but it would shift authority. It would move the center of gravity away from family dynamics and into documented reality. And once that shift occurred, there would be no way to quietly return to the old arrangement. I took time with this decision, not because I was afraid, but because I respected the weight of it. Acting calmly doesn't make an action small, it just makes it clean. I asked myself one question repeatedly. What outcome am I willing to live with, even if no one understands my reasons? The answer surprised me with its steadiness. I wasn't looking to be validated. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I wanted accuracy to matter more than familiarity. That ruled out confrontation. Confrontation centers emotion. It invites debate over intention. It keeps the narrative interpersonal. I had outgrown that frame. The decision I chose was quiet, procedural, and final in its own way. I would present myself, fully, directly, and on record, to the systems that had formed conclusions without me. I would not argue against my parents' statements. I would simply exist in parallel to them. This wasn't about disproving concern. It was about rendering it incomplete. I understood that once I did this, reactions would follow. Confusion, panic, attempts to reassert control, maybe even hurt. But those reactions would not be mine to manage. That realization felt like crossing a line internally. Not away from my parents, but away from the role that required me to cushion everyone else's comfort. I didn't inform anyone of my decision. I didn't hint at it. I didn't rehearse speeches in my head. I just began the process, step by step, in the same quiet way I'd done everything else. Decisions made in silence often look like nothing until their effects appear. I remember one evening closing my notebook after writing a final checklist. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of victory, just a calm acknowledgement. This will change things. Not all change announces itself with noise. Some of it moves like a tide, slow, inevitable, and indifferent to who's watching. I had chosen the path that didn't ask for permission and didn't offer negotiation. Not out of defiance, but out of respect for my own clarity. Once that decision was made, the rest was execution. An execution I knew by then is rarely visible at first. If you want to change a system, you don't announce your intention. You meet its requirements. That was the guiding principle during this phase. I didn't act dramatically. I acted thoroughly. I began by requesting direct evaluations, formal, documented, and current, not as a rebuttal to anything, but as a baseline. I presented my records without commentary, income histories, expense tracking, savings, behavior, decision timelines. I let the documents speak in their own language. There was no emotional framing, no mention of family, no explanation of context beyond what was required. I learned quickly that systems respond best to clarity without narrative. At the same time, I ensured that future communications would not rely on intermediaries. Wherever possible, I positioned myself as the primary point of contact. Not aggressively, just correctly. This alone changed things more than I expected. Questions came directly to me. Clarifications were requested from me. Assumptions had to pause long enough to be checked. The narrative about me didn't disappear, but it lost momentum. Still, no one noticed. Not my parents, not extended family. From their perspective, everything was the same. I was still quiet, still agreeable, still not interested in handling these matters. That invisibility was useful. I responded promptly. I followed procedures exactly. I didn't over-explain or under-deliver. I made myself easy to work with, not because I wanted approval, but because efficiency accelerates outcomes. Moving in silence requires discipline. There were moments when I wanted to say something, small comments that would have signaled change. I resisted them, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. This phase wasn't about being seen, it was about being placed correctly. I noticed how different the language became when professionals spoke to me directly. Questions were specific, assumptions were fewer. The tone shifted from concern to assessment. Assessment is neutral. It doesn't need a story. Meanwhile, my parents continued as they always had. They spoke with confidence about my limits. They expressed concern to the same people, using the same phrases. They had no reason to adjust. Their version of me had always been sufficient. That was the quiet tension of this period. Two narratives moving forward at the same time, unaware of each other. I kept meticulous notes, not because I anticipated conflict, but because transitions create gaps. I wanted continuity. The hardest part of moving in silence wasn't patience. It was restraint, knowing that clarity was coming and choosing not to rush it. Trusting that accuracy, once entered into the system, would begin doing its work without my supervision. I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt positioned. There's a difference. Visibility is about attention. Position is about influence. By the end of this phase, the groundwork was complete. Nothing had happened yet, at least not in a way anyone else could see. But the system now had two sources of information instead of one, and those sources did not align. Misalignment is destabilizing. It forces a review. I closed my notebook one night and realized I no longer felt anxious about outcomes. Whatever happened next would be based on reality, not reputation. That was enough. The rest, I knew, would unfold on its own timeline. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They rarely do. What arrived instead were delays, follow-up questions, requests for clarification that had never been necessary before. Small procedural pauses that felt insignificant unless you understood what they interrupted. At first, my parents noticed nothing. Why would they? From their perspective, they had done everything right. They had provided guidance, expressed concern, spoken confidently on my behalf, the way they always had. The system had accepted it before. There was no reason to suspect it wouldn't continue to. But systems don't like unresolved contrasts. When two narratives exist side by side, someone eventually has to look at both. I became aware of the shift before they did, because I was inside the flow of communication now. Questions that once would have been filtered through others came directly to me. Can you clarify this timeline? Can you confirm this figure? Can you walk us through how you made this decision? Neutral questions, professional questions, the kind that assumes capacity by default. I answered them calmly, precisely, without commentary. Somewhere along the way, concern began to lose its authority. I could feel it in the language. Phrases softened. Certainty turned into conditional statements. We were under the impression, replaced than we were told. That difference matters. My parents, meanwhile, began to sense something was off. Not in me, but around them. Decisions took longer. Responses were less immediate. Their reassurances didn't land the way they used to. At first, they blamed bureaucracy, then miscommunication, then timing. They didn't blame me, not yet. What they were feeling was a loss of traction. The quiet discomfort of realizing that a story you've been telling no longer moves things forward. I noticed the subtle increase in their checking in, questions disguised as concern. Are you feeling okay lately? Is everything getting a bit overwhelming? You know you can tell us if you need help. The irony was almost gentle. I responded kindly, truthfully, briefly. Yes, I'm fine. Things are steady. I've got it handled. They heard those words, but they didn't absorb them. They had never needed to. Still, something had changed. Their certainty was no longer being echoed back to them by the world outside our family. And without that reinforcement, concern starts to feel like doubt. They began repeating themselves more often, reasserting familiar points, as if volume might restore alignment. It didn't. What struck me during this phase was how impersonal the consequences were. No one was punishing anyone. No one was accusing anyone. The system was simply doing what it does when faced with conflicting information, slowing down and reassessing. That reassessment created discomfort. My parents felt it as uncertainty, as a sense that something they couldn't see was shifting under their feet. They didn't know what, only that outcomes were no longer predictable. And unpredictability is unsettling to people who believe they are protecting others. I felt none of that panic, not because I was detached, but because I understood the process. This was the middle stage, the part where old narratives haven't collapsed yet, but no longer function smoothly. It's an awkward place to be. I stayed quiet, not strategically this time, but naturally. There was nothing to add. Everything that needed to be said was already on record. The consequences had begun, not as drama, but as friction, and friction, once introduced into a system that depends on smooth assumptions, doesn't resolve itself quickly. It builds. By the time my parents realized something was truly wrong, it was already out of their hands. The first sign wasn't confrontation, it was urgent. Their tone shifted. Not louder, but sharper. Conversations that used to feel casual suddenly carried an edge, as if they were trying to catch up to something moving faster than expected. They asked more direct questions, not of me at first, but of others. They sought reassurance where they used to offer it. Why is this taking so long? Has something changed? We've always handled this. Handled, past tense. What they didn't yet understand was that the system had moved on from trust to verification, and verification doesn't respond to confidence, it responds to evidence. I could sense their confusion turning into anxiety when familiar phrases stopped working. When we were concerned, no longer closed discussions. When she's always struggled with this was met with silence instead of agreement. Silence, this time, wasn't mine. It was institutional. Eventually, the questions reached me, no longer wrapped in gentleness, but in concern that felt newly personal. Did you say something? Did you file something we don't know about? Why are they suddenly asking you instead of us? I answered honestly, but not expansively. I was asked directly. I provided information when requested. I didn't think it needed commentary. Each answer was true. Each answer offered no handle to grab. That's when panic entered the room. Not loud panic, but the brittle kind. The kind that disguises itself as urgency to fix things. They tried to clarify, to explain, to restate their intentions. They framed everything as a misunderstanding, as protectiveness taken the wrong way. But intentions don't overwrite records. What they were trying to fix was no longer interpersonal. It was procedural, and procedures don't respond to emotional repair. I watched them struggle with the shift in real time, the dawning realization that their authority, so natural, so unquestioned for so long, no longer held weight. They wanted to smooth things over, to make calls, to clear it up. But there was nothing to clear up. The system wasn't confused, it was simply fuller. For the first time, my parents were reacting instead of directing, and that reversal unsettled them deeply. I felt no satisfaction in this, only a quiet sadness. Not because they were losing control, but because I could see how sincerely they believed they had been acting in my best interest, and how unprepared they were for the possibility that their certainty had replaced my voice. They asked me finally to help fix it, to explain how you really are, to reassure them, to make it go back to the way it was. That was the moment I knew it was too late, not because I couldn't speak, but because speaking now would only serve to restore a structure that had already proven unsafe for me. I told them calmly that everything I had provided was accurate, that I had answered questions honestly, that I didn't feel misrepresented. That last part landed heavily. They didn't argue after that. They couldn't. Arguing would have required claiming that accuracy itself was the problem. What they were facing wasn't rejection. It was irrelevant. The system no longer needed their interpretation of me. It had met me, and once that happens, you can't put the distance back. I went home that night and sat quietly, aware that something irreversible had occurred, not externally, but relationally. The dynamic that had defined us for decades had shifted, not through conflict, but through exposure. They could feel it, I could feel it, and no one knew how to undo it, because undoing it would require pretending nothing had changed. Something had. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of facts, just three people sitting in a familiar room, aware that the rules governing it had shifted. My parents invited me to talk. The phrasing was careful, neutral even, as if they were afraid that the wrong tone might fracture something already strained. They didn't start by apologizing. They started by explaining. They told me they had only ever wanted to protect me, that they had worried I would be overwhelmed, that they had spoken for me because they believed it was kinder than putting pressure on me. I listened, fully, without interrupting. When they finished, there was a pause, longer than usual. They were waiting for reassurance, for me to soften what had happened, to translate their intentions into absolution. I didn't. Instead, I said something simple. I understand why you thought that, I said, but what you thought replaced me. That sentence didn't accuse, it clarified. I told them I wasn't angry, which was true. Anger would have implied surprise, and I was no longer surprised. I told them I didn't believe they meant harm, which was also true. Then I told them what mattered. Those decisions had been made about my capacity without my participation. Those decisions had real consequences. That concern, once documented, becomes authority. They tried to respond, to explain again, to emphasize love, to return the conversation to intention. I let them speak, then brought it back to impact. I'm not asking you to feel guilty, I said. I'm asking you to recognize that you didn't leave room for me to be accurate. That was the moment something settled. Not resolved, but settled. They saw, I think, that this wasn't a conversation they could win by being right. There was no counter-argument to the absence. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand change. I didn't threaten distance. I simply stated a boundary. From now on, I said, I speak for myself. No anger, no emphasis, just a fact. They nodded, slowly, uneasily. What struck me afterward was how little relief I felt. Not because the conversation had failed, but because it had arrived too late to change the outcome. It could change the relationship, but not the process that had already corrected itself. And that was okay. Confrontation doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just names reality. I left that evening without drama, without a sense of victory or loss, just with a clearer understanding of who I was in the room now. Not the managed one, not the protected one, just myself. And that quietly was enough. I'm not a different person now. That's the part people expect, and it never quite fits. I didn't become louder, or sharper, or more forceful. I didn't reinvent myself. What changed was not my personality, but my position, internally and externally. I no longer wait to be accurately perceived before acting. I assume responsibility for representation, not just intention. If something matters, I make sure my voice is on record, not implied. This hasn't made me colder. It's made me clearer. With my parents, the relationship is quieter now, but more honest. They hesitate before speaking for me. Sometimes they catch themselves mid-sentence and stop. That pause tells me more than any apology could. We don't revisit the past often, not because it's forbidden, but because it's been understood. Understanding doesn't require repetition. What I carry from this experience isn't resentment, it's discernment. I understand now how easily care can become control when it goes unexamined. How narratives harden not because people are malicious, but because they are comfortable. And how silence, when unchosen, becomes an invitation for others to define you. I also understand my own responsibility in that dynamic. I don't blame my younger self for staying quiet. She did what she knew how to do with the tools she had. But I no longer confuse restraint with safety. In practical terms, my life is steady, unremarkable in the best way. I manage my finances with confidence born of familiarity, not bravado. I make decisions slowly, on purpose. I ask questions when precision matters, and I don't apologize for it. The inheritance issue resolved itself procedurally, not with drama, not with celebration, just with accuracy restored. It's not the centerpiece of my life. It never was. What mattered more was the internal inheritance, the knowledge that I can remain calm without remaining silent, that I can be gentle without being invisible. That quiet doesn't mean passive. I don't need to prove anything now. Proof has a way of expiring. Alignment doesn't. If someone underestimates me today, I notice it, but I don't rush to correct it. I watch. I decide whether correction is necessary or whether the system will eventually self-adjust when given enough accurate information. That's quite dominant, though I never would have called it that before. Not control over others, but control over when and how I engage. I trust myself in a way I didn't before. Not because I'm flawless, but because I no longer outsource my authority to people who haven't asked to understand me. Who I am now is someone who speaks when it matters and listens when it doesn't. Someone who values records over reassurance and clarity over comfort. I didn't lose my family. I didn't win a battle. I simply stepped into my own voice and made sure it was heard where it counted. That's not a transformation you see on the surface, but it changes everything underneath. There's a certain kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises or raise alarms. It arrives quietly, wrapped in concern, reinforced by familiarity and justified by love. You don't notice it because it doesn't feel like hostility. It feels like care. That's what makes it powerful. This story was never about inheritance, even though that's where the consequences became visible. Money was just the surface. What was really at stake was authorship. Who gets to define your capacity when you're not in the room, and how easily those definitions harden into truth when they go unchallenged. The moral I take from this isn't that parents shouldn't worry or that families shouldn't support one another. It's something more precise than that. Concern is not neutral once it's documented. Silence is not harmless once it's interpreted. And being reasonable does not protect you in systems that reward confidence over accuracy. If you've ever been described in ways that felt slightly off, but not wrong enough to fight, you may understand how this happens. How roles are assigned gently, how expectations form without conversation, how your absence from decision-making is framed as relief rather than exclusion. There is no villain here, only momentum. What stopped that momentum wasn't confrontation or revenge. It was clarity, patience, and the willingness to let facts replace familiarity. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering anyone. It's about choosing where your voice enters the record and making sure it does so cleanly. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't owe anyone your silence, especially when silence is being used as evidence against you. You also don't owe the world an emotional performance to justify your competence. Sometimes the most decisive act is simply to speak once, in the right place, with nothing extra attached. Thank you for listening all the way through. Stories like this don't ask for outrage, they ask for reflection. So I'll leave you with a question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that someone else had been telling your story for you? And what did you do when you noticed?